Good morning. Quite often when my mum used to come and stay, when our kids were younger, she'd bring with her a bag of chocolate bars or something like that for the kids to share. And when she'd gone, the task of dividing them out would happen. And there'd be a real sense of this needing to be done fairly. So they'd all take one bar, and then if there was some left over, they'd take another, but in the reverse order. They have a high sense of fairness, do my kids. As does my wife. If we have a glass of wine at the end of a busy day, she's always quite keen that the two glasses have the same amount of wine in them. What she doesn't know is quite often I pour myself a little bit more and take a slug before going in to give it to her. We're continuing our series today on God is, and today's topic is God is just. I wonder sometimes if we struggle with this idea of God being just. We like him being loving and merciful and gracious and faithful, all-powerful, eternal, but just can be challenging. If we were making our own God, would we include it? We can't do that, of course. He's not made of Lego. But if we were constructing God, like taking one of those big Lego boards and sticking on attributes like little coloured pieces, what would our God look like? God is so big and amazing, it's really difficult to describe him. And as we've talked through this series, the different attributes we've mentioned are in a sense is a view of God, or perhaps a glimpse of God's essence. But they're not separate. These things are woven together. They can't exist on their own. God isn't partially loving and partially merciful and partially just. He's fully loving, fully merciful, fully just. And these things aren't in any sort of tension, as we might think. God doesn't wrestle with different sides of him. He doesn't go, am I going to be loving in this area, or am I going to be merciful, or am I going to be just? All the glimpses and views that we've got of God in this series are fully integrated. Every attribute we've talked about him is fully integrated, and all of these qualify each other one. So although God being just and righteous may be challenging for us, we can't ignore it or diminish it, because by doing that we're ignoring or diminishing God himself in his wholeness. So what does it mean for God to be just and righteous? Wayne Grudem says this: God's righteousness means that God always acts in accordance with what is right and is himself the final standard of what is right. Moses in Deuteronomy said this about God: he is the rock, his works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. And God himself speaks in Isaiah 45 and says, I, the Lord, speak the truth. I declare what is right. A result of God being just is that he must treat people according to what they deserve. So it is necessary that God punishes sin. Sin does not deserve reward. It's wrong and deserves punishment. If God didn't punish sin, then it would show him to be unrighteous and unjust. In Romans chapter 3, Paul is unpacking this and explaining that Jesus comes as a sacrifice for sin to show that God is just. Verse 26 says, he, that's God, did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. We're all well aware of the injustice on earth. Often we see it better in other people than perhaps we do in ourselves. We see people living lives of selfishness and sin, and the impact that that has on others, and the injustice that results from that. The way that people are treated because of the colour of their skin has been particularly highlighted this year, and that is a significant and insidious injustice. But there are many other examples of exploitation and violence in our times and throughout history that seem to go unpunished, that causes us to cry out to the God of justice. Adolf Hitler and the atrocities he oversaw, Saddam Hussein's violence against his own people, slavery throughout history, including the present day, are just some examples. And where is justice? For injustice to happen on a small or large scale, one of three things have to be absent: a lack of power to bring justice, a lack of awareness of evil, a lack of compassion. Impotence, ignorance, impassivity. At the start of Psalm 10, the psalmist talks about some of the injustice and wrongdoing he sees in his world, and he complains that justice doesn't seem to be done anymore. But as the psalm goes on in verses 16 to 18, he does go on to recognize that God does not suffer from the lack of the 3 points I've just mentioned. Verse 16, the Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from his land. God has total power over all creation at all time. He is not impotent. Verse 17, you, Lord, hear the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them. God is aware of the evil that is going on in our world then and now. He is not ignorant. Verse 18, and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed. God reaches down and acts with compassion to those who need him. He does not lack compassion. And the result is, at the end of verse 18, that mere earthly mortals will never again strike terror. Ultimately, God's perfect justice and righteousness and his total love and compassion met at the cross at Calvary. God was fully aware of the evil in the world, not just the evil of a few people, but everyone from Adam and Eve onwards, including me and you. He was not ignorant. God was fully capable of dealing with sin and bringing punishment and justice. He was not impotent. God was compassionate to people and showed his love by sending Jesus. He had compassion. We can be confident that we live in a world ruled over by a just God, where no sin goes unpunished, whether we see it or not. But in his perfect justice, God has sent Jesus to take that punishment for us, for those who choose to accept that forgiveness he offers. The second verse of the hymn, Here is Love, Vast as the Ocean, sums it up better than I can. On the Mount of Crucifixion, fountains opened deep and wide. Through the floodgates of God's mercy flowed a vast and gracious tide. Grace and love, like mighty rivers, poured incessant from above, and heaven's peace and perfect justice kissed a guilty world in love. Rejoice and celebrate that God is just, for to live in a world with no justice would be unbearable. But rejoice too in the love of God in sending Jesus to deal with our sin and grant us his forgiveness.